You're listening to Witch Wednesdays, a semi-weekly podcast source for all things witchcraft in the modern world. Join your host, Steph, on Wednesday mornings to chat about seasons, Sabbats, and all new witchcraft topics to help you make your life more magical. Welcome back to Witch Wednesdays. I have a guest here with me today to chat about her new book, and it is a topic that I know very little about and not something that I have incorporated into my practice. So I'm so excited to chat with somebody that knows more than I do on this and can offer all of you some insight. So I am going to turn it over to her so she can introduce herself and let you know where you can find her online.
Hi everybody, I'm Joey Morris. I am the author of Celtic Hedge Witchery, a Modern Approach. I'm also the creatrix behind Starry-Eyed Supplies and many other things attached to Starry-Eyed Supplies, including Celtic Witch Coven, the Patreon. And I've been on YouTube for a really, really long time, and you can find me at Starry-Eyed Little Lady on YouTube as well, and all the usual social medias. So that's me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for being here today, and congratulations on your book, Celtic Hedge Witchery. It's very exciting, and the cover is very beautiful. And I absolutely love getting into it because, like I said, I know the basics of like Celtic background and the basics of hedge witchery, and that is literally it. It's not something that I've incorporated into my practice. So I'm so excited to get my hands on your book and not only learn more about hedge witchery, but also like bringing that into the modern day. Very, very interesting book.
Thank you. That's lovely to hear always.
So for listeners who are maybe like me in this and very beginner to this, can you explain what is hedge witchery and specifically how you modernized that along with the Celtic background?
Yeah, sure. Okay. So hedge witchery is a term that is usually applied to witches who either work at literal hedgerows, which is a European feature, and it's quite quintessentially British actually, although they've made their way across Europe now, and also refers to witches who sort of combine spirit work with plant magic. And this is sort of this loose definition that has been bandied around for a little while. And I felt it was a little bit like lacking, I think, that it meant more than that to me. And I kind of wanted to write this book as like it's a love letter to my personal journey, really. And so the sort of definitions that made sense to me and evolved as I worked along this witchy practice and in my journey. And so I take it into the spiritual realm, and I bring in the idea that you don't have to have a physical hedge if you want to be a hedge witch, because all of these locations exist in the spirit world. So there's that element, and then the Celtic element is my background. It's what I'm surrounded by. It's my ancestry, but it's also what I felt called to, and it kind of interplayed into the hedge witchery in some interesting ways. I work specifically with the Morrigan and how that kind of fed into what it meant to be a hedge witch. There's quite a long I'm trying to summarize. There's quite long sections of like what is a hedge witch, redefining a hedge witch in the book. So I'm trying to summarize.
It is definitely a big topic.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like hedge witches kind of seek out otherness. That's how I put it. I was just like, I feel like hedge witches are on this journey and have this real interest in liminal spaces. So physical and non-physical spaces that are like between realms of existence and where you can feel spirit and feel the sacredness in nature. So it, for me, comes from a place of nature and being or inspired by trees and plants and certain areas and things, and then kind of like investigating that, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, I think it's that liminal space concept that trips up a lot of beginners. Because
Mhm.
it's once you get started in like practicing it, it comes more easily, but just as like a cerebral sort of thought process, it's strange. So it's a little difficult when you're a beginner.
Yeah, I think the best way of maybe describing liminal spaces to a beginner is when you have that feeling that you are in a space or in a physical location, or something is like tapping at your soul and you're not entirely sure why yet, but it feels magical. And then you kind of get that call to investigate, that call to adventure, that call to know more of the mysteries and things. I think that's maybe the easiest way of putting it to beginners, maybe.
I like that definition. I do think that works. So
Yeah.
what was your journey like? How has it been for you in your practice, your path, and then specifically in coming to the decision to write this particular book?
So I've been solitary my entire path, my entire learning experience through witchcraft and spirituality for the most part. And when I began, the only thing that was really available was forums and books on Wicca. And so that's kind of how I started in a spiritual path, but it didn't resonate with me as strongly. And since then, it's kind of been like piecing bits and pieces together and discovering things along the way, and looking at witchcraft in my local area and as much information as I could lay my hands on. I read for a really long time before practicing anything. I think I read for about 5 years before I really, really started practicing anything. And I tried to read everything I could get my hands on, putting things into practice a little bit, also having a kind of inner knowing about certain things, even as a child, and an inner belief structure. I was so obsessed as a child with trees and storytelling and elements and nature, and that played a massive role in my soul remembered something. And a big part of what has become Celtic Hedge Witchery for me is kind of like soul purpose, soul memory things that are just kind of slightly out of reach, but we kind of have a strong pull towards them, as well as elements of activism and wanting to protect the world and know more of the world and be a part of the great ecosystem that is this earth, and seeing how we fit into that tapestry rather than a very modern perspective that the world is here to serve us rather that we are a part of it. And that is something I've always really believed strongly in. And all of these kind of threads are reasons why I ended up writing the book, because elements of it exist out there. You will hear people talk about certain ideas out there. You will hear people talk about animism and spirit work, and you will hear people talk about the three cauldrons, but not often, not regularly, not as cohesively as I would have liked it. This is very Virgo of me. So I was like, I'll write the book, and because that's what calls to me. Um, it
Love
was my journey, so I was like, okay, I'll do it. Um, and yeah, and that's kind of how Celtic Hedge Witchery was born.
I love that. That's very, very I'll just do it myself.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is really funny. Um, is this something because you do obviously the it's not just a book about hedge witchery, it has a lot of Celtic
Yes.
influence in here. So is this something that is accessible to anyone who wants to pick up the book, even if they don't have a Celtic background?
I hope so. It was my intention for it to be accessible, and the theories. So the book starts off like theories of the hedge universe and everything, which is me looking at the world through a spiritual lens. And that's in generalized terms, that's not Celtic specific. There are things in the book which are a little bit more Celtic specific. The Three Cauldrons is from Irish mythology, and that's energy system in as an alternative to chakras at its most basic level. And there are concepts and ideas of spirit work, which you don't have to have any Celtic background in. And then things like nature and tree spirits and plant spirits and sacred groves and things like that, which have a little bit more of a Celtic leaning, but they're not Celtic specific. So sacred groves are very important to druids and the ancient Celtic people, but anybody who has a deep love of trees or wants to connect to nature or the local spirits in nature, I think would get something out of this. And you don't have to have a Celtic heritage or background to connect to those aspects.
That's excellent because I know that I have a lot of listeners in the States, and sometimes the Celtic stuff can be hard because it pulls on a lot of, like plants and things that maybe we don't have here or aren't as widespread in the States. So I do like that the things that you include in your book, to me at least, seem very accessible. You don't have anything in there that I've never heard of before, as far as the ingredients and things that you have or the specific plants that you call on. I'm like, no, I'm familiar with these.
Yeah. I mean, I was working with Judica, who's in America, so I think if I'd have said anything that was really alien to her, she would have pointed that out to me. Because I did want to try and make sure it was accessible to people, because I know that there can be a little bit of that. And I have said in the past, if people, I think I say it in the book, I'm pretty sure, that there is the Ogham, which is a divinational set of staves based on trees, but it is very European. And I think in the book, I even say that if you want to create your own with your own trees in your own area, with the folklore that surrounds them, you can absolutely do that. So it's adaptable. I don't think there is anything that prohibits you. And we do talk a little bit about accessing the spirits in the spirit realm anyway, which I think is accessible to everybody, no matter where you are. I think you can connect to the idea of the hedge and the idea of different spirits wherever you are in the world because everything is interconnected through the spiritual ecosystem.
Do you have any advice to give to beginners who might be a little wary of starting with anything to do with spirits?
I would say plant spirits and trees, well, especially tree spirits, aren't as scary as a lot of the media might make out that certain spirit work is, because to me, all of that is natural. So it's just knowing that everything has a soul, everything has a vibration. So the same way that you can love your animals, you can connect to plants. And that to me doesn't have to be a scary thing. It can just be about having a conversation or making a connection in the beginning. You don't have to, I don't know, you don't have to be summoning anything or in a circle or doing anything that makes you feel deeply uncomfortable, especially if you come from a background of that requires healing from religious guilt and things like that. So it's just making contact with the natural world around you and realizing that everything is alive, and perhaps, that different life forms express themselves differently to humans, but that doesn't mean that they're not aware or have a sentience or have a soul or have a spirit. So maybe that's the thing to try in the beginning, is just sitting with a tree and seeing how it feels, or really meditating on a particular plant and seeing if you get any feelings or images or anything like that.
And speaking of, you have a lot of really great visualizations that you include in your book as well, especially
Yeah,
with connecting with
thank you.
plant spirits.
Yeah, I love connecting with plant spirits, and I also try and point out that everybody's experience with that will be different. So you might not visualize the way that I visualize, but that's perfectly okay.
I think it's still like helpful to have a guide though, something like that when you're just starting out or it's like a new topic to you, a new plant to you, just having like a little guide there to read can be really helpful.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's taken me a long time to trust my own intuition with these things as well, and that's something that I talk about quite a bit because I think often our greatest obstacle for things like visualizations with plant spirits and things is we've got all this doubt about what we're seeing and feeling and experiencing is real, and then kind of like I said, some people have that religious guilt that comes from engaging with the natural world, which is a shame really, because it's the natural world. There could be nothing more natural, but there is this idea that spirituality is divorced from the earthly realm, and so it can be something to get over, a bit of a hurdle.
And do you think that's a hurdle for quite a few people just in the way that our modern world is set up?
Yeah.
And it's difficult not only for the spiritual side, but also even just like connecting with the earth, like from the more modern technology-based perspective, it sometimes feels very hard to get back to your roots.
Absolutely, yeah. The modern world it gets more and more artificial, doesn't it?
It does.
It's scary, really, and it makes me feel like a Luddite sometimes, but I'm also like massively resistant to it. I'm like, why do they want us to be divorced from the natural world? That doesn't feel like a good thing at all. Um,
Yes, and I think that's a big part of your book and a big influence is just so much connecting with nature and outside the things around you. I think that's a beautiful aspect of it.
Thank you.
And you also include a lot, besides just the visualizations, you have a lot of, you have rites. I usually use the word rituals, but you call them rites in here, which I really like. I enjoy that. But you have so many great ones, and I think there is a whole variety of skill level on them. So I really appreciate you including those.
Oh, I love that sort of thing. I love a little bit of practice and a little bit of example on how you could do something. I never want to tell somebody how they should, but maybe an idea of how you could do something. That's how I like to approach it because obviously we're all different. We all connect in different ways, and I think that's beautiful. But yeah, having an idea how somebody else might do it, I think can be super helpful.
I agree, and not everybody is as into the visualizations, so having like a hands-on practice is a nice part of that as well.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's the really beautiful thing about a lot of plants, especially if you're using edible plants, safe to eat edible plants or plants that you can have in teas and things as well. It gives it a real physical element to the experiencing of that plant and gives you like different ways you can tap in. So if you're not a big visualization person, you can try embodiment, you can try drinking a particular herbal tea and seeing how your mood changes or how your body feels or anything you note throughout the day. Did it change anything for you? And lots of little different things that you can try because not everybody's strong in visualization. And we need to include things different ideas. I think different things that everybody can have a go at, and it doesn't have to be one modality fits all.
Sometimes I am just a better hands-on learner and like doing things for myself just helps me remember, like understand and remember the material a little bit better.
I'm a big
Plants
fan of
especially.
any. Yeah, I'm a big fan of anything that really taps into the way that we process the world. So a lot of the book talks about memory and how memory is, in my estimation, I guess, the currency of life force. The reason we're here is to create memory and feed it back to the higher self. So anything that sort of aids in the way that your neural pathways fire and create new memories and things is really, really important. because if you are scent orientated, you like being quite tactile. You like learning by rote and redoing things over and over again. Depending on how you prefer to interact with material, is really going to give you the best experience. And I think that's really important as an author and from books, because I really don't like being. This is terrible. I really don't like being told what to do. Um,
How very Virgo of you again.
I know again. Oh, we're in a Virgo moon as well. I was like, oh no. um, but I like suggestions. I like really good conversations. I like ideas and meeting of ideas and things like that. I like things that get you thinking or inspire you to have a go at something that you might not normally have tried. Or when people talk about ideas and different ways of practicing witchcraft that you've never heard before, or is a different take on something, and you're like, oh, that's interesting. You know, I love that. I love that in witchcraft circles in general.
I love that too. And then you can pull the things that resonate with you. Because I was like you in starting out, that everything was Wicca. And I was like,
Mm,
Wicca is a little too restrictive for me
yeah.
because there are a lot of exact ways that things should be done. And I am like you, I rebel against that. I'm like, no, no, I'm
Hmm.
gonna do it my way.
Yep.
But we can't deny that modern witchcraft is based so much in Wicca and has pulled so much from it that it'd be like impossible to completely escape. So there are good things that I like pulled from all of that learning that I did back then, but the
Mm.
organization of it was a little too much for me.
Yeah, I'm the same. I don't hold anything against Wicca personally, but it's a little bit too much like church once you get into later. Um, the further down you go into the work, it becomes a little bit too restrictive for me personally. So, but I hold nothing against it. I'm grateful for the information and the information being there as being like a doorway into everything else. But it wasn't for me long term.
I agree. And I appreciate that books have branched out so much more because that's really all there was in the 90s, early 2000s. Like everything was so Wicca. So
Hmm.
I love the breadth of information that we're getting now. Makes me so happy.
Yeah, me too. It's much more interesting to learn all these different ways. Even if you're not going to necessarily practice that way, I think it's always really interesting to hear about how different people approach things. I love that. I love all the different ways to paint, you know. I think that's great.
Yeah, that's why I read so many different books, even though I'm like, no, what I'm not gonna practice that way. But there is always like some little tidbit that I'm like, oh, I could change that. I could make that work for me. It's always something
Mm,
interesting to learn about. And
yeah.
you know what? That brings me to my next question that I was going to ask you, because this is one where I am completely on the fence about deities and deity work. And I like change my mind monthly, maybe even weekly, I'm just at this moment at some sort of like crossroads. So I would love to ask you about the Morrigan because it does come up in your book, and
Hmm.
you are a priestess of the Morrigan, and that is a goddess that is so intriguing to me, and I would love to chat about that next.
Okay, absolutely.
So could you just start with who is the Morrigan? Knowing what a big question that is.
Yeah, so it's a very, very complicated answer, but so the goddess Morrigan features heavily in Irish mythology, although there is also hints of her in other places across other Celtic countries. And the mythology that we have left, and bearing in mind most of it has been translated by Christian monks, portrays the Morrigan as a goddess of war, a shape-shifting goddess, a sorceress. There are many, many different aspects to her. So I'm trying a poetess, a prophetess. She's very magical. She's very liminal. The way that I most connect to her is through her shape-shifting element, because I think that is the place in the middle that connects everything else. She can shapeshift into whatever she wants to be. This includes animalistic form, which shows up quite a bit in her mythology, and also includes other forms like a phantom, and depending on which versions of the mythology, there's a version where she appears as a leper woman and other aspects of herself. So she's a goddess of sovereignty, a goddess of land, a goddess of conflict and overcoming conflict. She's it's such a massive subject that I'm trying it's like trying to condense the ocean into a cup. Um,
Do you
um,
think that that's why witches are so attracted to the Morgan in particular? Is because there's so many facets?
I think that dark goddesses are on the rise in general because of the need for sovereignty and empowerment in
Love
modern times.
it. Love it. Yes.
I think that a lot of people may not come to the Morrigan for the right reasons, because in the beginning, a lot of people are like, "Oh, she's going to smite my enemies," and I'm like, "No, she isn't." And so those sort of reasons to coming to the Morrigan don't hold up very long because she will destroy your life just to make you rebuild it up from ground up. And a lot of people who come to the Morrigan for the right reasons, I mean, I'm being a little bit value judgy in that, but the reasons that I think the Morrigan calls to certain witches and people is that they have been through something traumatic. They have already survived something horrible. And it's an unfortunate but deeply connective part of what I have seen from a lot of followers of the Morrigan, that they have been through this horrendous thing. They've rebuilt themselves, or they're in the process of healing and rebuilding themselves and re-empowering themselves and reclaiming themselves. And the Morrigan comes in this, I see you. I honor you. I honor what you've been through. And it kind of, for a lot of people, that's where the modern aspect of the warrior comes in, like all the battles that you've endured and overcome and survived. And you haven't let it break you, but you also haven't let it turn you into an awful human being. Like you haven't continued abuses against anyone else. Instead, you want to be the line stops here. I will not allow that to continue in the world. I will protect others from that behavior. I will raise awareness about that kind of behavior, these kind of threads. So a lot of people come to this path, have the Morrigan come in from these kind of experiences. And I tend to say there are two types of experience with the Morrigan. There's those that work with the Morrigan for a period of time to help them through a particular difficulty. And then there's the lifers like me. We're here for good.
Lifers is a
Yeah.
great word for that. No, I think it is that dark goddess energy that I'm seeing like such a rise of. Um, Morgan, Hecate, that like everybody is, but that makes sense what you said. Why that might be needed right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's fighting back, isn't it? It's fighting back against religious and societal control, and particularly those that want to put women's rights back into the Middle Ages. So of course they're on the rise. Of course they are.
And do you think that I know the answer to this from my perspective and from yours, but I'm going to ask anyway, so listeners will know the answer to this. But do you think that the Morgan and the Celtic pantheon would be something that is open to beginners and to people who don't have any Celtic heritage whatsoever?
It's a little bit complex in the beginning, just because it's a little bit difficult to find people talking about the mythology in the same way. I think that's why I was called to the Celtic path, because I was such a mythology buff even as a kid. I'd read so much mythology. I loved it. But finding the Celtic mythology was a little bit harder. So it's not completely inaccessible. You can find it, and there are more people talking about it now than there were back in the day. It can be, as I suppose, a little bit more academic because it's not as readily explored as some of the other mythology when you're coming to it.
Oh, yeah, I could see that for sure.
Which might put people off a little bit in the beginning, but there are some really good books on the mythology now. My favorite one for the Morrigan is by Morpheus Raviana, the Book of the Great Queen. She covers all of the mythology and puts it into a manageable way of an accessible way of reading about it. But I don't think that should be too much of an obstacle. And I personally am very against the idea that your religious path is it's determined by location when it comes to the Celtic gods. The Celtic gods were travellers. The Tuatha De Dan, in particular, the pantheon that the Morrigan joined up with, they were travellers. They left Ireland and went around the world looking for treasures and knowledge and travelling around talking to people before they came back to Ireland. And in history, that's true of the people as well. So the people throughout Europe traded and married and fought and all the rest of it. So there is an interplay between these things, and borders are a modern invention anyway. And for the Celtic pantheon, I don't think there are moral concerns the same way that there are for other closed religions, and Celtic is not closed. So I think it should be completely accessible to beginners. And I think if you are called and you deeply feel that in your heart and soul by a Celtic god or goddess, you should absolutely explore that.
I knew that was going to be your answer. But I just know so many witches that I've talked to when they have these open practices and open pantheons, they're like, everybody, yes, come learn more, come join. It's like so open and welcoming. And I know that Celtic is one of those as well. So it's just nice to hear somebody that, practices that say that as well, not just coming from me.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a big believer in it. I mean, I've seen the other side of it and when it comes to the Celtic stuff, and the other side of it is ugly and I don't like it one bit. Like they're trying to determine what your ancestry is and if you are this heritage enough. I don't like any of that. I think that's a problem in our world that we don't need more of. We need more inclusion, we need more understanding, we need more connectivity, and I think this is one of the ways in which we can explore that.
Agree completely. And before we wrap up, I would love to ask if you have any last advice that you would like to offer to somebody who is maybe listening to this and thinking, I am interested. I think that maybe Celtic hedge witchery might be for me. Do you have any advice for those people of like where they could get started or something they could look into?
Well, it's like get your hands on everything you can get, really.
Okay, I love that answer.
um, it depends what kind of element of Celtic hedge witchery you are interested in. If you're more interested in the hedge witch side, I shall open up my bibliography and give you some examples because memory doesn't work. But there are some really wonderful books out there. So Ray Beth is an older author, and she's been around since the beginning, but her books are really interesting, and she has letters between herself and her students. So she has one book which is literally her students asking her questions about hedge witchery and her responses to that. So that could be quite interesting for beginners, because if they come across these sorts of questions, that might well be answered in the book. And what else did I put in here? Well, Lady Charlotte Guest has a lot of translations of the mythology. She has the Mabagonian, for example. Christopher Hughes is great if you're interested in Welsh Celtic mythology, particularly Ceridwen. Gosh, there's so many.
I was going to say too, that's something that I usually call out about books, and I totally forgot to do that. But you do have an extensive like notes and bibliography in here, which I always appreciate in
Oh,
witchcraft
absolutely.
books. But yeah, you have so many, and I think it's like a great way to point people towards, like you said, there's not as much on Celtic mythology, at least not written in a way that's easy to understand. Maybe more like Greek mythology, I find a lot on in
Yeah.
lots of stories, lots of modern updates and things, and not as much with the Celtic. So you really do offer a ton of information in your bibliography, which I very much appreciate.
Oh, absolutely. Gosh, I'm coming off as so Virgo in this interview. It's terrible. I'm not usually that Virgo. It's the moon. I'm telling you, I promise. But yes, absolutely. I think we need to share where we get the information from. We need to, uh, you know, honor other authors and hold other authors up and things like that. You can also find quite good stuff on YouTube these days. I would remember to take everything with a pinch of salt. You don't have to agree with everything you see, read, or hear. And that's probably one of my biggest pieces of advice when you're starting to investigate is take everything not with like a critical eye, but like be open, but also consider it from your own perspective and bring your own intuition into things as well. Because just because it's in a book or just because somebody says so doesn't make it correct. It's always good to go in with a curious mind, but also kind of contemplative. Say, do I agree with this? Sit with it. You don't have to agree with it, and that's okay. I think that's really important.
Oh yeah, I think that's always excellent advice too. And especially when it comes to deity work, the Morgan has so many facets. So like your experience with one deity might not be the same as what you listen to somebody else have on YouTube, and neither one of you are wrong. It's
Yeah,
just such a vast, pantheon to work with, and like so many deities and different aspects of each deity that it might not be the same as somebody else, and that's fine.
yeah, absolutely. And often what we're getting in our path anyway is a reflection of who we are, just as much as it is who the gods are. And I think that's important to remember too, that the way that somebody works with a deity is tailored to them.
Yes.
So they are a factor in the equation, and that's why I don't like the idea that there is one way to work with deity or anything, because I'm like, well, the human factor is at play. So
Absolutely. Could not agree more. Well, Joey, thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate chatting with you and you discussing all of these topics that I am not super familiar with. So it's nice to have a voice here that could lend a little more insight.
well, thank you so much for having me on Witch Wednesdays. This is super exciting. Thank you so much.
And listeners, I am going to have everything linked below so you can check out the book, but that you can also check out everything else that Joey mentioned. You want to order things from her beautiful shop, I will link that and link the Instagram. You take really beautiful photos, by the way.
Thank you.
So I'm going to have everything linked for people to check out because there is so much more that we weren't even able to get into. And that will all be in the show notes as always and over at witchwednesdays.com. And that is everything that I have for you this week. I will see you all next week.
Need even more witchcraft in your life? Subscribe to Witch Wednesdays on Patreon and YouTube for all types of exclusive bonus content like spells, recipes, book reviews, and more, or even order personalized tarot readings and spells. Be sure to follow on Instagram at Witch Wednesdays Podcast. And you can find all these links and more at witchwednesdays.com.